This is a story of how and why the recovery of this knowledge has been hampered, hidden, and manipulated, and how these provocations were motivated by a myriad of issues facing these early of science and government in the 1800s, and how it has had a real effect on society today. To gain an understanding into this larger history of the science and silence surrounding these ancient cultures, one must come to understand the influence of these three men and the influence that they had on this early American history. E.G. Squires published the very first publication of the Smithsonian, the Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley. And the next man is Lewis Henry Morgan. He's the American father of anthropology, and had many ideas that were really accepted by so many of the theorists of the 1800s. And then you have John Wesley Powell. He's the American father of conservation. And these early men of science came together in the mid-1800s in Buffalo, New York, to form a subset of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, with both Morgan and Powell later becoming president of that organization. In the first chapter of this book, Lost America's Antiquities, A Hidden History, I share examples of how history has been handed down to our day by quoting Will Durant, who, after writing his multi-volume history of the world, pointed out how history can become greatly distorted over time. He stated, "Our knowledge of past events is always incomplete, probably inaccurate, but clouded by ambivalent evidence and biased historians, and perhaps distorted by our patriotic and religious partisanship. Oftentimes, history is like viewing the nightly news. It is a matter of perspective. It is like changing the TV channel from Fox to NBC to CNN. There always seems to be a political twist associated with every major news event, as history is oftentimes socially engineered, advanced by historians who are motivated by political, religious, and social prejudices and agendas, shared by those in power, usually the victor. As the African proverb states, until lions have their own historians, the tale of the hunt shall always glorify the hunter." As Princeton professor Robert P. George stated, "Oftentimes what we know about history is just propaganda." A good example of this is the story of Columbus' discovery of America, which oftentimes starts with the myth of the flat earth. Thomas Aquinas and other notable scholars and philosophers of medieval times in Europe all knew that the earth was round. The idea that these thinkers of Europe prior to Columbus believing that the earth was flat is preposterous, as pointed out by Thomas E. Woods in his book, How the Catholic Church Built Western Civilization. Even Andrew Dixon White, in his 2-volume History of the Warfare and Science of Theology, goes on to say that the evidence is overwhelming, that refuting this myth is like refuting the idea that the moon is made of cheese. These men observed the shape of the moon and the sun. They understood eclipses, and they stood on the shores and slowly watched as the ship's masts disappeared over the horizon. So has history and the science has been used as a tool in shaping society's perceptions and views? And is it being used today? Such as the question can be asked, who discovered America? Every October, America celebrates Columbus Day. And why do we do that? Was Columbus the first to sail the ocean blue and land on the shores of America in 1492? The truth of the matter is that in the maiden voyage in 1492, that Columbus never set foot on the shores of North America. Yes, he landed in the Caribbean islands, now referred to as the Bahamas, on October 12, 1492. So was he really the first? On the History Channel, on October 17, 2013, In a show entitled The History of the World in 2 Hours, it stated that for the first time, Columbus brought two continents together. For the first time, these continents became connected. Was Columbus really the first? Many historians from many parts of the world find it quite humorous that here in America that we still celebrate this idea that Columbus discovered America as if there was not others here before. As Professor Kehoe stated, the feasibility of crossing the Atlantic to the Americas in small crafts has been repeatedly demonstrated. As she cataloged some 17 crossings of small boats, regarding the possibility of transoceanic contact with America before 1492, Dr. Kehoe stated, "The only fact that needs to be stated, that every type of boat and sailing raft has been proven capable in experienced hands of traversing the ocean. The presumed utter isolation of America before Columbus is implausible. To a mariner in a sailboat, the ocean waterways become highways. Emerging evidence shows a pre-Columbian contact with America to be extensive." So the question isn't who was here before Columbus? The question is who wasn't here before Columbus? History from many foreign lands share their histories of these pre-Columbian voyages, such as the Vikings, the Syrians, the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Egyptians, the Jews, the Polynesians, the Japanese, the Chinese, the Welsh, and the list goes on, all of which make claim that they had seafaring vessels capable of braving the ocean. Driven by the prevailing winds and currents, they visited many foreign shores. A modern example of this is the 2000 sailing of the Phoenicia. On October 2009, a replica of an ancient Phoenician ship, which was built in Lebanon, was built from ancient plans owned by the British Museum, dated 600 BC. The ship's initial plan was to make 3 stops down the east coast of Africa. But upon getting down to the Bay of Good Hope, with the hope of stopping 5 times up the west coast of Africa, as it turned the corner, the winds and the prevailing currents started to push this ship ever westward. And they were fighting it all the way. But they pushed it within 350 miles of landing in the Americas before they could catch the upper currents and be able to get this boat to head back towards Lebanon. What they learned is what the slave traders learned of old, that they could go back and forth from America to Africa in just following the prevailing winds and currents. Today, the debate still rages as to whether or not there were many ancient migrations to America or just one. A single origin, referred to as monogenism, which espouses the idea that virtually all early inhabitants of North America migrated across the Bering Strait land bridge some 40,000 years ago, or polygenism, the idea that America was populated by a multitude of cultures arriving in America from different origins. Since the mid-1900s, the U.S. government ethnological community elevated their efforts to classify the Indian tribes by assembling them in harmonious groups based on relationship of blood, language, customs, and grade of culture. It was found that within the area of the United States that there are spoken over 500 Indian languages as distinct from one another as French is from English, and that these languages are grouped in more than 50 linguistic families. Along with a large number of diverse linguistic families from hundreds of different tribes that existed here in America, they found differing traditions, DNA, and oral histories, making it more increasingly difficult to hold to this traditional view that virtually all North American Indians crossed the Bering Straits some 40,000 years ago, as really was embraced by the likes of Lewis Henry Morgan and other mainstream anthropologists even today. Dr. Donald Yates, a DNA expert who is part Cherokee Indian, states that it wasn't his family that was chasing woolly mammoths across the Bering Straits some 40,000 years ago. He says, I know better because I have been able through DNA to trace my family to the hills of Galilee. If that is so, has history and the American Indians' knowledge of this been taken from them? Perhaps the greatest atrocities and injustices found in America's history are the atrocities described in tribal histories. These American Indian populations have not only suffered great hardship in the name of manifest destiny and American expansionism, but they have been robbed of their ancestral history. Following an introduction screening of our documentary, The Lost Civilizations of North America, I had a conversation with a woman who identified herself of Indian descent. To paraphrase her comments, she referenced the fact that the Indian people have been led to believe that they are a people without a history. In fact, their ancient history has been labeled prehistory, as if there is no recorded record of their population's existence. She went on to emphasize that for the sake of her children, that they needed to gain a greater knowledge and appreciation of their identity, their heritage, and the richness of their culture.